Hi, my name is Nick Loris. I'm the Vice President of Public Policy with C3 Solutions, and we're here with another installation of our interview series. And I'm pleased to be joined today with John Shively. He's the Chairman and CEO of Pebble Limited Partnership, joining us from Alaska. John, thanks for taking some time today.
Well, Nick, happy to be here.
Well, great. Before we get started into some specific policy questions, I wanted to have our audience learn a little bit about you, the background of the project, and where things stand right now.
All right, well, just shortly about me. I've been in Alaska since 1965. I came up as a VISTA volunteer, like the Peace Corps, done a lot of work in the Native community, served two different governors, one as Chief of Staff and one as Commissioner of Natural Resources. I've been involved with Pebble since 2008, either as CEO and for a while as just chairman, and now as chairman and CEO. The project itself was discovered in the late 1980s by Cominco, mining company out of Canada. It's located on land owned by the state of Alaska that's set aside for mineral development. And it was taken over by Northern Dynasty Minerals, another Canadian company, in 2005. It's the world's largest undeveloped copper project. It's the kind of project that our country used to be proud of. I'm not so sure anymore what our country's proud of in terms of natural resource development, but this is a world-class prospect. It's got 57, we estimate right now, about 57 billion pounds of copper. Copper, of course, is absolutely essential to anything we want to do with electricity, and certainly for the green economy. So 71 million ounces of gold, about 3.4 billion pounds of molybdenum, which is needed for steel, some silver and rhenium. Rhenium's important to the defense industry. Northern Dynasty started working on the project, as I said, in 2005. We spent 15 years and over $150 million on environmental studies because we knew it was an environmentally sensitive area. It's located in Southwest Alaska in the Bristol Bay watershed, home to the largest sockeye fishery in the world. But we were convinced, based on our work, both our engineering work and our environmental work, that we could do the project and coexist with the fish. We submitted our request for a permit under the Clean Water Act to the Corps of Engineers in 2017. A final environmental impact statement was published in July of 2020, indicating the project could go forward, that we could coexist with the fish. And then the Trump administration rejected our permit in November of 2020, based on the fact that they said our mitigation plan for wetlands was inadequate. We can get into that in more detail if you want later. And it was not in the public interest. And one of the bases for that was I thought the jobs might be bad for local people because they live in a subsistence economy, which is proven absolutely incorrect by mines like a Red Dog mine up in northern Alaska, where over 50% of the people there are Native employees. They also said a catastrophic event could basically destroy the fishery. There's no evidence of that in the EIS. So we're appealing that. We appealed that in early 2021, and that appeal is still in effect. In the meantime, EPA has another way of trying to shut us down, which is called a preemptive veto, where they want to veto the project before it even gets started. They are using some of the same false logic that the Obama administration used to try to do the same thing. That proposed determination, the comment period closed at the end of September, and they're prepared to make a decision at the end of this year, sometime in December. I think there's no question that they will go forward with a proposed determination to shut us down, and then we'll have to decide whether we want to go to court to appeal that. So anyway, that's sort of where we are, Nick. It is a great potential project for the nation, a project that's needed, given what's going on in terms of trying to build out electric infrastructure, making electric cars and things like that. So we can chat about that in any way you'd like.
Yeah, let's chat about it all, John. There's certainly a lot to unpack in just that relatively short amount of time. I want to first start with what the Trump administration said and the Army Corps' environmental impact statement, because I think there's a lot of politicians, even some who have traditionally been supportive of mining in the United States, that have said, this is just a huge natural resource, but it's just in the wrong place given the proximity to the Bristol Bay watershed and that potential tension with fisheries and the sockeye salmon. But as you noted in the environmental review, the Army Corps concluded that the project wasn't expected to have any measurable impact on fish numbers or long-term changes to the health of the commercial fisheries in Bristol Bay. And then you had that final determination saying that there was more mitigation that was needed to satisfy the demands of the project. So I was wondering if you could get into that a little bit more as to what the Army Corps of Engineers actually said under the Trump administration, what your plans were to satisfy those additional mitigation requirements, and why that wasn't enough to satisfy the Army Corps and the Trump administration's needs.
Yeah, it's a very complicated issue, and I'll try to simplify it. So we're in wetlands. We're impacting wetlands. I think about 5,000 acres, and so we knew we would have to do mitigation. Now, in Alaska, it's hard to do mitigation in the traditional sense, because let's go to Louisiana, and if you're using wetlands, then to mitigate, you can go find wetlands that have been disturbed someplace else and remediate. Well, Alaska is about 50% wetlands, and very little of the wetlands have been used except for communities. So remediation is not really an option. So when we started out, we basically said, okay, we know we're going to do this, and we know in other projects you've allowed options to remediation. And so we proposed to fund some rural village sewer and water projects. There are villages that have either no sewer and water project, running water and sewer, or inadequate systems that needed to be fixed. We were going to do some fish work with the Department of Fish and Games to fix culverts that were impacting fish passage, and we were going to do some beach cleanup near our port. And we went along with that plan from when we submitted the permit request in 2017 up through early 2020, when the Corps came to us and said, no, that's not going to work. And eventually they came to us, I think in August of 2020, and said, what you have to do is you have to do in kind, in place. So that means whatever we did had to be where our project is, and had to be the same kind of wetlands. So we worked with the state to set aside, basically, since there was nothing to remediate, then the only other option was preservation. So we worked with the state to set aside about, depending on how you calculate it, 7 to 10 times what we were impacting in preservation. We presented that plan to the Corps. We had been talking to them all along from August, when they told us we had to do this, right on through when we submitted it in November. And 4 days after we submitted it, they turned it down. They basically said it wasn't adequate. Some of the things they said about it just weren't true. I don't want to get into the technical legal parts, but we believed we did what they asked us to do, and then they said no. And on the other side of it was, they said it was against the public interest, that we might disturb the culture of people who live subsistence lifestyle. If you talk to people out there that live subsistence lifestyle, they will tell you they need money because they have boat motors, they have snow machines, they have to heat their homes, have electricity. So having a job is very important, and populations out there have been declining because there aren't any economic opportunities. So I think that was just wrong. And then they basically said if there was a catastrophic event, we could do permanent harm to the fishery. The environmental impact statement did not state that. It stated exactly the opposite. It's clearly a political decision. We do know that Donald Trump Jr. was opposed to the project. We do know that he talked to some government officials, what other political pressure was brought. It's a difficult project. We do have some people that have come out against us that, like Senator Manchin, who generally is pro-mining. And right now, for reasons that are, I think, more somewhat as much political as substantive, both our senators are opposed to the project.
Yeah, and I think, thinking structurally through the permitting process, I think there's been a lot of frustration, kind of systemically, like you said, in terms of what we're for. There's been a lot of frustration kind of across the United States in trying to build and develop natural resources or build energy infrastructure projects, whether it's been, pipelines, transmission lines, renewable energy projects, and certainly mining projects. So not necessarily even unique to the proposed Pebble mine, but something that is a little more unique is this notion of this preemptive veto, which I don't know if that many viewers are aware of. So can you extrapolate into kind of what happened during the Obama administration with this preemptive veto and what the Biden administration is trying to use this now too? Because I think a lot of folks, I think on the left and the right, there's kind of this notion of we need more supply side progressivism. We need to be able to build things faster if we want any type of clean energy transition, or even if we want to keep energy prices and things like copper affordable, reliable, and dependable. Yet we have these regulatory processes that are politicized and also, a lot of times focused on process rather than outcomes. And, one concerning factor with regard to this project is this use of the preemptive veto, not just for Pebble, but what it could mean for mining projects and projects, across the United States. So can you get into what the Obama administration had did and then kind of where things stand with the Biden administration?
Yeah, just a little bit of history. When the Clean Water Act was passed, there was a debate as to who should be the lead agency in the permitting side of it, the Corps of Engineers or EPA. And in the end, what the Congress did was they made the Corps the lead agency, but said that EPA could veto the project if they didn't like the permit that the Corps was interested, or that the Corps was issuing. So that veto, I think, has been used only about 13 times in the country's history, 13 or 14. And generally, it's used, first of all, by EPA as a negotiating tool to threaten the veto to get more things they want in the permit. But it's been used, other than I think in one instance, once the Corps has made their decision about the permit. And that the one exception to that was the Obama administration retroactively vetoed a project in West Virginia. So the Obama administration set out to do something they hadn't done before, which is to veto us before we went into the permitting process. And they started down that process. They did a series of studies, wrote a proposed determination. We were able to stop that in court. We got a preliminary injunction claiming that the relationship between them and our opposition, the environmental community, violated the Federal Advisory Committee Act, that the kind of relationship they had violated that act. And so that got set aside. The Trump administration ultimately dropped the proposed veto. The environmentalists sued. We won at the lower federal court, lost in the Ninth Circuit. So that was remanded back to the Alaska judge. that decision. That happened after Joe Biden was sworn in as president. The EPA asked for the judge to remand the whole thing back to them, and so they started to basically build on the proposed determination that the Obama administration had written and published their own. Now, to sort of add on to your permitting, what a mess the permitting process is, and I was pretty amused to read something from the Brookings institution the other day, admitting that they're having a lot of trouble getting green projects through the permitting process, which is no surprise to any of us who looked at it, but it is a complete mess. And Joe Manchin, thought he had a potential fix to it. Of course, that has not worked out. And to be perfectly frank, we've got several things. The process itself takes way too long, and the Manchin fix tried to put definite time limits into that. But we also have a system where judges keep rewriting what the bureaucracy does and making new law. And as a result, getting anything built in this country is very difficult. And in addition to that, in terms of sort of the broader big project things, it's the not in my backyard philosophy. And you look at President Biden's major push for green energy is offshore wind, but the commercial fishing industry is going to fight him tooth and nail on that. Sort of my favorite thing was his vote in Maine last November, where they voted to stop a proposed transmission line out of Canada that would have brought green energy. People want all this stuff, but getting it done is very difficult. And if you want, we can also talk about at some point how much it's going to take to get where these people want to go.
Yeah, no, I'd love to talk about both those things, because I think this is a good time to broaden this conversation out about, this proposed permitting reform idea. As I know, Senator Manchin was handing out pieces of paper that showed in the US it takes 10 years for a mining project, whereas if you looked at places like Canada and Australia, it's 2 to 3 years. And would love to hear your input on what's needed to get that timeline down to places like Australia and Canada, because I think you're exactly right. The companies that I talk to, and from what I've heard, is that these companies, these investors, they don't necessarily care if the environmental standards are strict. It's more that they just want the certainty that that's actually going to be the standard, instead of oftentimes what we see are these, vague, subjective standards that are often then left to the courts, and these projects are held up for years in litigation. So it's not about circumventing any strict environmental requirements, but actually just getting to a better systemic platform where there's much more regulatory and confidence and certainty in the process. So what should policymakers be focused on when it comes to permitting reform?
Well, I think the timelines that Senator Manchin tried to get at certainly is one of them. I think the idea of having one lead agency, and that agency being able to hold the other agencies, because there are many federal agencies involved in all these permitting, at least for large projects, to timelines, and just say, this is when you're going to have your comments in, and if they're not in, they're not in. That's not our problem. It's your problem. So that side of it, I think, is important. The litigation part is more difficult, but the problem with the litigation in this country is that when you litigate against a project, which the environmental community does constantly, there's no risk for them. And what they do is, they'll pick, 5, 10, 15 issues, throw them all against the wall to see if the courts can find at least one of them to stick. And then if even on one of those they win, often they get compensated. So, from my perspective, one of the ways to get some handle on that is, if you're going to compensate, then, the ENGOs should have to compensate the other side for all the issues they lose on. And that would, I think, quickly cut down on the number of issues that had to be addressed and maybe facilitate the judicial system. The fact that judges, like to reinterpret the law, I don't know what you do about that. And the fact that, once, Congress knows that these problems exist, and yet, and I don't know how many times I've seen courts, particularly the US Supreme Court, say, well, and Congress should address this, but they don't.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that was even some of the frustration with the mansion permitting process, is that, a lot of people felt left out in the discussion, felt like there was a lot of good things in that bill in terms of trying to shorten timeframes and timelines and try to have these environmental impact statements be more condensed, but also left a lot to be desired in addressing some of the other bigger problems that we face with permitting. Let's talk about this, energy transition. At C3 Solutions, we take a broader, all of the above approach in recognizing that we're going to need an abundance of natural resources really across the board to meet our energy needs and the world's energy needs, while at the same time understanding we can make environmental progress, we can make progress on reducing emissions. So would love to hear kind of where you see Pebble as part of this process, understanding that, if we don't do things here in the United States, it's not like we're going to stop consuming these resources. It's only going to offshore them to other countries and potentially making the environment worse off, having higher greenhouse gas emissions. So how do you see Pebble Mine and just the US and its abundance of natural resources, broadly speaking, fit into this equation?
Well, I mean, obviously for Pebble, the big piece is copper. And there have been a number of studies. I mean, demand is certainly going to outstrip supply in this decade, and maybe in 2 to 3 years. And a study that was done by S&P Global recently said that by 2035 we'll be almost 10 million metric tons short of supply. So that's going to drive things up. Right now, 65%, I mean, there are two problems with getting supply. One is mining itself. And, there are, I think, 4 major mines in this country right now that have resources that could help with the green economy that the Biden administration is fighting. And so, that's the first problem. Second problem is we don't process here. So you mine it, but you end up with something called a concentrate. That has to be processed as a metal. So you take copper, for instance, 65% of the world's copper is processed in China. And, we haven't built a new smelter in this country, I don't think, for copper in probably 4 to 5 decades. And people think that, I mean, Pebble is actually doesn't come close to what the country is going to, just this country is going to need, to say nothing of Europe and China and everyone else. And just for this country is an estimate that the mining companies need to invest $100 billion by 2030. I mean, that's a lot of money for people to think about investing when you're not even sure you can get through the permitting process. You want to talk about lithium, which, for the batteries to store this stuff. Prices have risen 1,000%, 58% of it's processed in China. Rare earths, 68% of it is mined in China, 80% of it is processed in China. And then you look at where the demand goes. So if you have an electric car, you need about 400 pounds of minerals, about half of which is copper, for that vehicle. For a conventional car, it's 80 pounds. If you want an offshore wind turbine, you need 15 tons per megawatt, half of which is copper. For natural gas, you need a little over a ton of minerals. I mean, what is needed to get to where people want to go with the green economy, I think is not understood. And policymakers either don't understand it or are misleading people. I mean, there was a quote by Gina McCarthy when they were talking about investing $3 billion in EV battery development, that it would take place without new extraction or mining. I mean, it's like, what are you thinking about? And we won't get there. I mean, and so what's going to happen is the price is going to go up. I mean, I just gave you the example of lithium. And who does that hurt more? It's going to hurt the poor, because the cost of electricity, I mean, you look at California. California is, you know, sort of the leader in trying to get green energy. They have by far the highest electric costs in the country, and of course not reliable. And one other thing about green energy that I've not seen much written about, I think, you know, the Biden administration wants to go to about half by 2030 or 2050. I can't remember which year, but anyway, right now, for the most part, if you're doing wind or solar, you're putting whatever electricity you have into the grid, and probably not storage. But as we know, solar only works half the day, and wind doesn't work all the time, either because it's not blowing hard enough or it's blowing too hard. So if I look at it, if you want to do solar, you need about 2.5 times the capacity in order to get. So if capacity is A, you got to have 2.5 times that, and then build the storage. That's going to be very expensive electricity.
Yeah, and you're right. It's expensive electricity that disproportionately impacts the poor and low-income families who spend a higher percentage of their budget on energy costs, and that represents a real opportunity cost for them when they're thinking about feeding their families and paying for healthcare and education. That they have to make a lot of difficult choices about this when energy costs rise. So that was very well put. And again, I think your point about investment and investors, you know, thinking through these projects and if they actually want to invest, knowing they're going to have to spend tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars to try to get through the permitting process. And it could be more than a decade long, as we've seen with projects like Pebble, with Keystone XL, and they're still not through the process. And that disproportionately also can impact a lot of startups, where, you know, you have a small modular nuclear company who may not have the financial means to wait that long, years on end, and spend tens, hundreds of millions of dollars going through the regulatory process. So it's a real big problem here in the U.S. and in other countries as well. But it's really striking to me, the amount of resources we have, the amount of energy abundance and resource potential that could help spur economic development and keep energy prices in check, as well as making significant strides in reducing the costs of greener energy, so that other countries will adopt those technologies. Yet we're still in this holding pattern. Lastly, I know we're quickly running out of time here. It's can't believe it's already been about half an hour here. But I want to go back to something you said a little earlier in the conversation. You know, just generally about Alaska politics and your work with Indigenous communities. You know, I know this is a controversial project, but also Alaska has had a long history of understanding the benefits of natural resource development, you know, oil and gas production, but also the importance of being environmentally conscious, of ecotourism and tourism broadly, and working with Indigenous communities. So I just wanted to give you a chance to talk about how Pebble relates to that, because given some of the tension and given some of the politics in the lower 48, we hear a lot about the project, but don't hear everything with regard to how this project relates to Alaska's long history and tradition of making sure energy production kind of goes hand in hand with environmental protection.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, you know, just a little more about me. I have a degree in political science, so the fact that I'm running a mining project is probably amusing to some people. But this is a huge state. We're fifth the size of the whole rest of the country. We have made the biggest commitment to conservation ever in this country when the Alaska National Interest Lands Act passed. Over 100 million acres of protected lands, wildlife refuges, wilderness parks. And we have the largest state park system in the country and two of the three largest individual state parks. So, we've done a lot to preserve lands, but we also need to develop. And I think if you go to the North Slope and look what we've done in the oil industry and how it's become better and better and better, the footprint has become smaller and smaller as we've developed newer fields. We do try, we think we do it the best, actually, because we have a sensitive environment. And we knew that going into Pebble, and I certainly did when I became CEO in 2008. But I had been involved with the Red Dog mine up north of the Arctic Circle on land owned by an Alaska Native corporation, and I was working for them at the time. And Red Dog is the largest zinc producer in the country, and pretty close to the largest zinc producer in the world. And that mine's been going, I think, since 1989. Over half the employees have been Alaska Natives. So, the reason I took the Pebble job was I understood that it could have a great positive economic impact on local people in places where there just aren't any jobs. Rural Alaska has no infrastructure. They have no roads to get in and out to most villages. It's by air or water. And so the economic opportunities are limited. Natural resources development is one of those things. So when I took the job, I told the two partners at the time, I didn't know whether it could be built or not environmentally safely. But after the work we've done, I'm absolutely convinced it can be and should be.
That's great. Well, John, I really want to thank you for your time today. Where can people go to follow along with the project's development and your work?
Yeah, just put Pebble Mine into the and we have all sorts of stuff comes up, but we have a website, and you can go to the website and we sort of let people know what we're up to and when people need to comment and things like that. And if people want, they can put directly on a contact list. So when we send things out to people we know are supportive of the mine, that they know what's going on.
Well, great. Well, thanks again for your time. And for those watching, please check out the rest of our videos and interviews on Facebook, on YouTube. You can read our work at c3solutions.org and check out our online news magazine where we talk a lot about innovative solutions to our greatest economic and environmental challenges. That's at c3newsmag.com.